Hello and welcome back. It's time for another SSD test on the PS5. Today we are looking at the newly released WD Black SN850X, and we're going to be comparing it in performance and load times on the PS5 versus this, the Seagate Firecuda 530. Now, we're going to be testing a bunch of games on PS5. We'll keep it nice and short. Before we go any further, a few disclaimers straight off the bat. First and foremost, the Seagate Firecuda that we're utilising is the Star Wars Mandalorian edition. It uses the same heatsink it's used on the other ones, but with that Beskar design on top. Also, we're going to be using WD Black SN850X, but we're not going to be using the first-party heatsink, unfortunately. So we are not going to be looking at temperature differences between them. I apologise for the different SSDs. Unfortunately, I do not have more comparable drives here in the studio. So I wanted to highlight that very early doors, because for some users that is going to undermine the overall result. But what this is about is understanding if there are any differences between them in terms of performance, that we can kind of rat it out between them. And unfortunately, this is as close as I can make here in the studio for this SSD testing, so I hope you won't hold it against me too much. But for now, let's crack on with the SSD test between them to see which one loads quicker, if at all, in the PS5 system. So straight away, the first thing we wanted to do was look at the initial benchmark. The PS5 does benchmark SSDs that are put inside, so I got the initial first benchmark from both of them. The first thing that struck me is the Wolf 530 just took a fraction longer. It did the benchmarking. It's again very respectable numbers, very comparable, very small amount of difference between the pair of them. And this was the first indication, however, to me, where IOPS was a factor we need to discuss. And again, I will get onto that in just a moment in a lot more detail. But when we compare these two SSDs, it's about understanding that difference between traditional transfer or sequential performance and IOPS, something that's becoming increasingly apparent. Now, the next test was moving 250 gigabytes of game data from the internal PS5 SSD over to that M2. You can see there it moving across between the two of them, and although I have sped up this footage, I think 7.09 times speed I think it was during the edit, a thing that you should really take on board here as we're moving this data is twofold. One, spoiler alert, the WD Black will do the job a pinch quicker. The other one is look at the estimated numbers that are being thrown around there on screen, because the estimated time left, as we see the two jobs finished there, when we sped up that time, that the Seagate Iron Wolf there took a pinch longer. Now, saying a pinch is actually a noticeable degree. Now, there's a margin of error there of maybe a handful of seconds, 2 to 3 at most. But the movement of that data is where the IOPS there, the smaller file types that are spread all around the place, made that big difference. There's not a lot of just big block single data. It's actually quite a lot of smaller data that's getting archived and opened up. So let's see how that translates in games as we load here into Assassin's Creed Valhalla. This was an early PS5 release there, and again, all of the games that we're going to be looking at today are the PS5 versions of all of these games. And what we're looking at is, in most instances, world load data, but there is the odd difference there, and that will make sense a lot more through the video. But the first thing we're doing here is a world load into Valhalla from the title screen, and again, same save spot, loaded in directly from the title screen into the respective world of Valhalla on each of these SSDs. So the initial boot into the animation, the WD took the tiniest of leads there as we go in, but as we go into the buffer screen there, we can see right now loading in pretty much identical. Like, the difference between them is so minimal, it isn't even worthy of that comparison there. Both of them running side by side, both of them running near enough identical frame rate there, both of them running no texture problems, no draw distance problems, no silly T-poses, no texture swap issues as things are swapped out as far as distance is concerned when we jump into the literal bird's eye view. You know, not to ruin this video too much for you, but there's going to be a lot of that. When it comes to the overall running of these games, just typically, you're not going to see any difference. I'll go into a little bit more detail on that in just a moment. But as we come out of this game, we can make our way into the second test, and this is a fast travel item from within the world map. Just activating the fast travel, moving to another part of the in-game world and loading in those brand new assets there. So once again, you've got the Assassin's Creed buffer screen there, which is when you've got the mainline character, then it loads in to our bird's eye view there. You can ignore the little pop-up there on the left of the screen there. Again, that through multiple tests on this game, that pop-up screen there does change its timing. It's not really linked to what's going on. But one thing that's really, really interesting about games like this, and this won't be the first example, the next game will also show this off, lots of stuff to do with silent loading. And by that what I mean is there's an initial large-scale chunk of data at the beginning, and then as you go through the game, the idea is for there to be, for a reason of immersion, no in-game loading unnecessarily. So that fast travel, that was to force a loading segment there. But predominantly what you'll find is games load that first chunk of data, and then as the game wears on, more data is kind of pulled from the NVMe as the game world needs it. And with Elden Ring being our next test game here, this is another enormous example of a game where there's the initial load, and then the game is designed outside of fast travel segments to have all of that background data constantly being pulled out of the NVMe into the cache with the assistance of memory, and then into that GPU for management, with the CPU kind of overseeing the whole damn thing. That's an oversimplification, I appreciate, but with our first world load test, we're loading from the gameplay, from the title screen into the gameplay for this. And as we do this load here, it's worth highlighting that we are loading into the Stronghold, which is an early segment of the game. I think the Seagate Iron Wolf drive was maybe a fraction of a second quicker there on screen, but hardly enough to justify it or calling it in any kind of way a leader on this. I think both of these, there's so many different factors you could have called into play there that fraction of a second isn't really much of an advantage. Also, the Stronghold is a very small area of the game. There's not a tremendous amount of asset data to be concerned with. Our secondary load test in this game will be a little bit more of a better indicator of that. But as we kind of checked again, no drop in frame rate, no drop in textures, distance, TPO, any of that kind of stuff. The game is loading everything it needs to from that NVMe that's being loaded onto the cache in the GPU. Absolutely fine there. And we'll get ready for our next test, which is going to be that fast travel test, much like we just did in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, loading in another whole pile of assets now. And again, this is going when the game is forced to not rely on silent background loading, but foreground loading, as we fast travel to the north of the map. And we've got that loading bar on the bottom of each screen, and boom, no difference. Absolutely identical between the two of them. And it's also worth highlighting as we kind of bench test this game, it's not, I mean, it's a beautiful looking game, but it is not. It's great looking and high for a Soulsborne game, but arguably there are much more impressively graphic enabled games on this system. But we go for this game because it is a fantastic example of silent loading and that texture swapping there in the background. And both SSDs do an incredible job of showing that they are very much up to task when loading games on the PS5 there, on that PCIe Gen 4 slot. I'm also quite surprised on the WD Black that horse didn't die on that drop there. But we'll draw to a close this test in just a moment as we make our way into our third game of 4. And this is going to be another example of a game with a very, very unique silent loading technique. And this is the Stanley Parable. This is the deluxe version, or ultra deluxe. And this is the PS5 remade version of this game. Now, why have I included a game that frankly originally came out in around 2013 or 14, I believe? Well, this game has a fantastically unique system of silent loading there in the background. A lot of games, a lot of the silent loading can be hidden behind motion or just distance or obscured fixed cameras or more. This game does it slightly different. Let's load in from the desktop here, loading straight in, and boom, pretty much identical, nothing between them. And as you can see, as you make your way through this area, you move into all these rooms, and a lot of these rooms have choices in them. And as you make those choices, the next room then will alter in some way. But what's really intriguing as you go through a game like this is when you're looking through the doors, the view you're seeing often isn't a room, even through a door, not just windows. What you're seeing is an angled and warped vector graphic, which then you are moving between. So each room isn't actually there yet. It's being introduced. Again, I've mentioned this in other videos. Head over to Boundary Break, an enormously fantastic YouTube channel where they talk a lot more about how this game's silent loading technique is utilized in that room by room view. It's incredibly unique and incredibly tough to describe. And what we're going to be doing shortly is repeating what we've just done there. Now, the reason I call it a second phase world load is because in this game, there are so many ways to have, there are many endings, and the game is based around a rotational pattern. Let's load in and check that loading. And once again, absolutely fine. Even on this PS5 high def version, fantastic loading as well. But with this game, the choices you make room to room will change the room you're going into, but also the game is built around this dynamic of constantly repeating the same beginning and then changing all these variables. So what we've done here is to go through the same methodology that we've just gone through, because it is an immediate repeat of the previous segment there. I've not done any other introduced areas. And what we're seeing here is the game having to load in different dialogue, in some cases different graphical changes there in the background. But between both of them, we're still seeing the game running absolutely smoothly. The load time absolutely fine. The frame rate absolutely fine. And ultimately, the game running like an absolute dream. We've only got the one game left on our test regimen to go through, which is, of course, Stray. Stray came out in, I believe, July, August 2022. And this game is a single test here. We're going to be going through a world load and a scripted event load here. So we're going to be loading in from the title screen, making our way in. Again, the game's loading from each SSD. Up to this point, I would say that the Seagate has probably loaded a fraction of a second faster than the WD overall, but those advantages have been fantastically small. And we're going for this world load and scripted event here, where the WD has seemingly done well so far is to do with those IOPS based stuff. But again, we'll get onto that later on when we move data back. But let's load in to Stray here. And there was a small advantage there to the WD. Once again, a very small difference there in terms of loading, but it was certainly there. And again, it's these tiny differences that I know most people who, you know, like to have fun in the comments will go, what's the point of the video? Great question there, mate. Long story short, you don't know this until you test this, and that's why videos like this exist. And those tiny differences, inconsequential as they are all based on architecture of these SSDs, something we're increasingly trying to look at here. But between these two, again, ignore the fact that they're out of sync now, because they've obviously done different things in each play as it's live gameplay. But between the two of them, overall, again, the difference is so small that both SSDs are still incredibly comparable in what they're doing, regardless of their price differences and architecture differences. Which leads us now to our final test of moving that 250 gigabytes of game data back onto the PS5's own internal SSD, a job that is a considerably slower task than our original transfer, due to the PS5 having its own bottleneck there, slightly slower internal write speed because it prioritizes read over write. Secondarily, data that's moving back and forth, it is being unencrypted and re-encrypted there, as well as compression being utilized throughout for the transition of data. But what's really intriguing, and again, you're going to see this play out during this transfer, is the WD Black SN850 has a notably higher IOPS performance level there. Now, as mentioned on the screen, as you can see, I do highlight that unfortunately, due to unavailability of certain capacities, the capacity of these two drives is different enough that it will make a difference on performance, and you really need to factor that in if you're looking at this comparison, because it does blur any kind of lead between the two of them. However, during a movement of data like this, the way the PS5 stores data, and we've looked at some of the kind of encrypted archives that are on these SSDs during tests, when we've connected them in, when we can get past the format, we can see that some of the cabs and some of the collections of data are such high high frequency, low volume, that IOPS performance becomes increasingly important, and that is something that is going to pan out during this transfer. They both do the job very, very close to one another, but ignore the greying of the Seagate screen. That's because it goes into low light mode. We will come out of that in just a moment. But as we transfer that data between the two of them, what we see is that the WD drive is certainly taking that lead. Hopefully that grey screen will light up again on the top left in just a moment. And there we are. We've seen the two of them getting close, but as you can see, the WD finished somewhere, even with a margin of error there of around 20 seconds, a little bit faster there. It's still small in the grand scheme of things, and you do have to factor in those capacity differences. And some might argue that at the top right of the screen there, ignore that cough, that the WD drive there still had 3 seconds left. Take my word for it, that 3 seconds there disappeared in less than a second during the recording. That 3 seconds was an inaccurate estimation by the system. But overall, between these two drives, there's so little in it that I'm not even prepared to call this as an advantage. Regardless of their price and architectural differences, they both clearly did an incredible job throughout all of our testing. If price is what concerns you, the WD Black is the more affordable of the two. If durability is what concerns you, go for the Seagate Iron Wolf. It has a lot more going for it there. The heatsink is better on the Seagate Iron Wolf, but the IOPS is better on the WD Black. But ultimately, either of these are going to be great for your PS5 upgrade. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Do let me know in the comments if you have. Don't forget to click like and subscribe if you want to learn more about this subject, as we cover as many SSDs as we can. And of course, click like so we know what you like, and then me and Eddie, who make these videos and articles, can get it right and give you guys what you want. Other than that, visit the links in the description to learn more, and I'll see you next time.